Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar news update video. So, couple of things to cover here, just a few things that I sort of missed while I was doing my initial coverage on the dawn of Yangchen. First up, some of the stuff from the podcast that Mike and Brian were on. I just feel the need to go over this again because I've seen a little bit of sort of kind of misinformation going around and people kind of putting accusations out there without fully understanding the situation. One of them to address is that people listened to the podcast and heard what Brian said about the animation style and immediately rushed to be like, I can't believe there's all those people spreading false information about the fact that the show would use 3D. And I just want to very much clarify the idea of like, it wasn't false information. That is the information we had at the time. So here, like I literally put up a post to make sure that people were aware of this. The timeline of what we knew about Avatar animation style over the kind of last few months. First time we ever heard about the animation style, said it was CG. This official article here on Paramount, on Viacom, down here, Brian Robbins, who is referenced on the podcast, says, we signed a deal to bring the original creators of Avatar back to the studios. They started Avatar Studios and they're well on their way in development on a series of CG films and a new Avatar series. So CG, aka 3D. He said it. The guy that they reference, one of the guys involved in bringing them on for Avatar Studios, said CG. Now, how much does he know about it? We don't know. But this was the first time we had ever heard anything said about the animation style. So, of course, we run with what is said until it's clarified elsewhere. Similarly, the Avatar Studios job listings came up and talked about this hybrid style. You can see here, develop and maintain an outstanding and customized look for the show that will require the integration of traditional 2D and CG elements, and they talk about, shader techniques to kind of facilitate this customized look that is, partially 2D, partially CG. This is why everyone made the comparison to like Spider-Verse and so on, which I think is why Brian references it. And then on the podcast, Brian then says that we will be using 2D, but basically with technology enhancements, which feels like it's just a slightly alternate version of saying what was said there. And just to get across the idea that they're not aiming to do specifically the Avatar, the Spider-Verse or Arcane style. They're going to do their own thing, but that it will be primarily 2D. And it's just the idea of, because Brian said this, it doesn't mean that this was false news back in the time. It means the guy obviously misspoke. Maybe that was the plan initially, or what. He didn't know about the exact technicalities of the style. That's what he thought was the case. But it's not, because of course Brian is a much better source about this. But the point is, Brian didn't say anything back whenever this article came out in September last year. He only said something now in end of June this year. So that's, I think, an important thing to just get across, that I think especially Avatar News had a few people, really calling them out for you said it was 3D, and it's like, well, everyone who reported on the news said it was, so that's just that. Next, this. I covered this when I did my kind of review, basically, of the podcast, and I went through everything, this little piece of news. Avatar Studios views expanded universe like books and comics as mostly canon, says there may be little tweaks. This is not anything to do with Avatar Studios or the way, I covered this. You can see I mentioned this. Try to keep everything canon, but stuff may need to be tweaked. That's basically what was said. I didn't really highlight this as an important topic from the interview because that's how most fandom franchises deal with their extra content. That they try to keep it as canon as possible because that's the reason it's official content is because it's meant to be somewhat important. They're going to try, but they might need to work around it a little bit. That's all that is being said here. This is more about, I saw a surprising amount of people just listen to this podcast and frame what was said here in such a weird way, as if they were saying that Mike and Brian are now basically sort of decanonizing some of the comics and stuff like that. And it was this weird sense of like, you're reporting on this as news because you're like listening to the podcast as you're saying this, but you're adding in this whole extra element that is not actually said in the podcast, that just because you seem to dislike some of those comics, that this is what they'll do with it, when the key word in the quote is little tweaks. That's all they say, that if something doesn't line up, there may be some little tweaks. Otherwise, we are proceeding as if all of this stuff is part of the proper universe and hopefully building on it. It's just like, it says it right there. There's nothing more than that. So just, really be aware of that. It just kind of highlights that you have to follow, in the right people who report on the news in the right way. Otherwise, you get some kind of weirdly biased kind of views on what the news actually is. I was really surprised to just see a few people very much sort of like projecting how much they dislike the comics and using this as the potential to sort of, in a way, get them out of canon and justify themselves not considering the comics canon. Not that that matters. Next, this is all related to this, fundamentally. Chronicles of the Avatar author discusses the dawn of Yangchen. So this is the main thing that got completely lost, because I think the day this came out, I got the book. So the only thing from this I really mentioned in like my videos was just that like he confirms there is a second Yangchen novel. I do want to address the fact that this is one of the few times I think just Avatar News sort of presented some information from this interview in slightly the wrong way. Kyoshi Books writer FC Yee says he's not involved in the animated Kyoshi movie coming to theaters and stuff like that, when the reality of it is that, like, no, he doesn't say that. That this is adding in basically like leaked insider information to a question that doesn't even reference that same information. So let's just go through this article and we can discuss all of this. So yeah, this is the first interview I think we've had with FCE since like Shadow of Kyoshi came out. So they do mention that there will be a second spoiler-filled interview when the book is published. I'm actually really looking forward to that, to see does he say anything of note. I'm wondering, might they like potentially, like after the first book releases, maybe announce the second book? We'll see what they do. First question: a lot has changed since you started Chronicles of the Avatar. The series didn't even have a name when you started. Avatar Studios had yet to be announced. Is the writing process any different? There's not much to really say here. He just kind of says that, like, oh, you know, it's interesting that the Kyoshi novels are now part of the source material, so he had to work off sort of stuff that he helped to create in the first place. The pandemic didn't help, and just the general themes of Avatar. There's nothing really of substance to that question for the most part. Were there some elements you established previously in the series you were excited to return to and take in a different direction? And he talks about the fascinating to see the Avatar struggle with their relationship with Avatarhood itself. A position that comes with expectations. Taking the office in new directions was a chance to establish that there isn't such a thing as normal Avatarhood, in the same way you can't say there's a normal human life experience. So that's interesting. Yangchen is a different Avatar to Kyoshi. What was it? Was it a challenge crafting compelling conflict for a fully realized Avatar? And this is kind of part of having read the book, the main dynamic here. I was just like, how do you make the story of a character who's already done like all of their training, is fully realized, like none of that needs to be done? How do you make that actually like really, really interesting? So how is the most powerful being in the world going to face opposition? And we see, you know, he goes through like Aang was removed from his people and his timeline. Korra was faced with rapid change. Kyoshi received no training. The Dawn of Yangchen tries to answer the narrative challenge by giving her the nominal high status that comes with being the Avatar, but it hinders her movements and makes people treat her like a figurehead. She's a dedicated pacifist whose solution isn't to immediately drop pacifist beliefs. The conflict comes out in the book through the astounding amount of effort it takes to be an effective leader under those constraints. Yangchen is someone who understands that when the populace thinks everything will work itself out, there's a small number of people doing disproportionate amounts of work to ensure that things will be better in the future. This definitely does come through in the book, and is actually a very good way to describe effectively what like the core dynamic of Yangchen is in this book, is that it is an Avatar who has the training, and skills to be a very, very effective avatar, and is actually good at doing that, but that it still takes an incredible amount of effort to, try and be this way, and not just end every conflict by, like, in a sort of Kyoshi-like way, and sort of in a way to do things the right way that set a good example, is this like exhausting thing, even for someone as competent and who will go down in history as being one of the more notable avatars. It's a real like challenge to make any of that stuff happen. And that's sort of the key thing, just highlighting that, in a way, for her to become such a legend, she put in like triple the amount of effort you would ever think would have need to have gone in. And this comes across, but is it going to be, in a way, like, this is what I talked about in some of our reviews, it's like, is this going to be as interesting as these fun dynamics of like Aang being so young, having the craziest situation to resolve? Korra mostly finished her training, key parts of it still to go, and then with just no kind of world knowledge in a world that's hugely changing. That's a great challenge. And then the Kyoshi dynamic from the first books is obviously so interesting, with like her past, the whole false avatar dynamic, and the whole Dao Fei training aspect. It's really interesting, and it's so fascinating to see how people will view Yang Chen coming out of this book as more of a sort of standard avatar, and if they can attach themselves to this dynamic as strongly as some of the other ones. So they talk about the Shang cities like Bin What are your thoughts on sort of making these places? And this is the most interesting kind of part of it, in a way, is to use parts of the show's universe as pieces of living history, which is only possible because of the brilliant work done by the original creative team. Book 2 of Yang Chen's story will probably take place in Taku, which we will get a glimpse of in the Blue Spirit as a once prosperous city now in decline. The show's world building has Taku as a place where cargo was distributed. It's not unreasonable that there would have been more cities like that, and the passage of time allows for them to be different than what we've seen before. So this is really interesting because, for one, he confirms there will be a second Yangchen novel. This is the first time we had actually ever heard about this. He doesn't name it or anything like that, but he at least confirms that there will be one. So that's good. Then he confirms that the main location for the second book will be Taku, which is one of the other Shang cities. So there's 4 of them. Bin is one of them. Taku is actually the only one in the Dawn of Yangchen we don't explore. So it kind of highlights that, okay, we're going to be tackling some similar topics, but doing with the place we didn't really go to. And obviously this is the only one of the Shang cities that I think is directly referenced in the show, and he references it right here. This information I think is actually, we have it from the like old Nickelodeon website, but he might have slightly different, having access to like internal stuff, but still interesting. And then here's the thing that I was referencing before, this whole thing. The question that's asked. Mike and Brian have been very hush about Avatar Studios. Do you have much insight into what those plans are? Are there any blood oaths you want to betray by giving fans an idea of what they can expect? And he just answers, honestly, I have none. The publishing arm is a different unit. I'm as curious as the rest of the fandom. To me, this is more or less a non-answer. This is him saying, I just write the novels. I don't know anything about that. And you question if he's even giving any sort of a statement on it in the first place. You'll notice the whole time there, the question asked and what he answers, nothing about Kyoshi. Because, again, the whole idea that the first 3 movies are going to be Kyoshi, Zuko, Korra is just insider information right now. And while we are aware of that, they are not acknowledging that officially. And so FCE isn't going to confirm that here. They don't even ask him in the question that is the case. And so the only problem I would have with this is that, again, an article like this seems to almost imply more than is actually said. That, oh wait, the first movie is a Kyoshi movie. Why isn't he involved in this? When the reality of it, he just gave a PR response to a non-specific question. He might very well be involved in some way. He's just not saying anything. And then even if he isn't going to be involved, and it is 100% confirmed that the first movie is Kyoshi, he is the novel writer. Like, I get the sense for the want of sort of continuity and stuff like that, but I think people are slightly over exaggerating the significance of, like, if he isn't involved or anything like that. Because there's a few things you have to acknowledge here. One, Mike and Brian did write Kyoshi before the Kyoshi novels. There's a reason we went into those novels excited, is because we sort of had at least a core foundation on who Kyoshi was. Mike assisted in that book quite heavily, to the point where he is actually listed on the cover. Whereas he's not listed on the cover for The Dawn of Yangchen, but is instead, like, thanked in the credits, basically. So it sort of highlights that much more heavily Mike was involved in this. And while, sure, FCE as the writer still did most of the work, the idea is that, you know, Mike knows Kyoshi as well, and he's going to be, you know, obviously working on the Kyoshi movie himself. And I do think when you lean too much into, you know, like, oh, it's going to be terrible if he isn't involved, it really, again, is this kind of weird thing of, like, why are we diminishing Mike so much? You know, like, they've done Kyoshi well before, like, and they've said they're going to pretty much stick as closely as possible to the canon of the books that we have already. I'm pretty confident they can do this, especially because, you know, FCE is a novel writer. He maybe doesn't have experience writing a TV show, or in this case, a movie. Now, maybe you'd want some sort of a consultancy style role for him to just take a look over the content and be like, yeah, that's roughly how I would have done it. But we don't know that that's not the case. Like, this is just sort of no one has all of the correct information, and so directly framing it in that way isn't exactly correct. Now, to be fair, in his article, he does kind of go through the sort of clarification I sort of just went through here. But people are just going to look at this headline that references the fact that that it's a Kyoshi movie and all this stuff is being confirmed, when it's not actually the case. So, just to be aware of that. But yeah, I'm excited for the spoiler-filled interview, just to know that FCE is going to say something again, and hopefully we'll maybe have more information on the second book by the time that happens. So, from there, last few pieces of information. Patterson Time has been delayed again. So this time to the 22nd of November 2022. So this is a 2-week delay. It was previously listed as November 8th. It's now November 22nd. But it roughly continues the trend of this book receiving quite regular delays. I believe this is probably delay 8, maybe 9. I've lost count. And I sort of have been counting. That gives you a sense for just how many times the date of this book has actually changed. When probably the person who covers the release date changes the most, I can't even remember. And I posted this on Twitter like yesterday, just the second I saw it, and was like, yeah, there's no way that this is actually going to come out this year, is there? At this stage, we're still like a few months before the release of this. We're still like 4 months out. What's to say we don't go into next month and it gets delayed into early December? Then we get into next month and we're in September all of a sudden and it gets delayed into late December. It only needs like 2-3 more delays and it suddenly is not coming out this year. And again, we bring up all of the things we've talked about every time this book has been delayed. This, I don't think, is down to them waiting for creators to make the content for this book. This is let me get the details up here. This is an 80-page book, minus 8 pages, give or take, for the sort of opening credits, ending sort of like advertisement stuff that they have. So there's probably only 72 pages of actual content in this book. From the preview pages, you can see here that this book is going to be reprinting all of the Korra Free Comic Book Day books. The new one, Beach Wars, isn't confirmed yet, but given how much it's been delayed, I'd almost be at this point shocked if maybe it isn't in there. And then it sort of creates a little bit of another problem if it isn't in there, because that means then that book will need to be printed in something else later on down the road. So who knows? So that puts us at like, we're probably already up to like 40-ish pages, give or take, meaning that there's only like 30-ish pages of content for news stories to fill in. So there will only probably be 2 to 3 news stories in this book, unless they give us a lot of very short ones. And it's been long enough now, especially with this one being planned for the anniversary year this year, for April. It feels like there's no way that this isn't done. In the same way that the other book that keeps getting delayed, which has stuck to its date now for a little bit now, that the Chibi comic being in January next year, that book has clearly been done for a very, very long time now. I'm convinced with at least some of these books, like the newer ones, they are just choosing dates to spread the releases out. That it is clear at this point that Avatar Studios has drastically affected what Dark Horse is capable of putting out. Which is why I wouldn't be hypercritical of Dark Horse when I think ultimately they have to get their source material to make their books official from Avatar Studios. So they're only sort of allowed to do what the licensing is allowing them to do. And if this is all they have, I get to a degree where you're spreading it out and not just releasing it all now so you effectively have no books next year. You need to keep that going. And it's frustrating, of course, because this year has not been good for comics and it doesn't look like next year is going to be good for comics. But they need to figure that out. And hopefully by the time they get to announcing what the Avatar Studios projects are, they can figure out what they can and can't do in the comics. Because this book's going to come out. It's going to be just a bunch of random short stories. Only a few of them will be new. I don't think it's going to blow us away. So it's not even a particularly exciting release in my mind. The Chibi comic also doesn't look to be particularly exciting. After that, what? The Chibi comic is listed as Chibi Comic Volume 1, so there might be a Volume 2. Who knows? Maybe plans have changed because it's been so long. But it leaves us in this weird state where we don't know what's next for any comics from Dark Horse. Because the only stuff other than this they have on their schedule basically is this book, which is out very, very soon. Book 4 Balance art book reprint. Turf Wars Omnibus. This will likely mean they'll have to follow this up with an Imbalance Omnibus and a Runes of the Empire Omnibus. So there's at least they have 2 more books in terms of reprint stuff that they can do. There's also Beast of the Four Nations, which is in a weird unannounced state, which will probably have to also come out next year. But that still leaves effectively no new story content once you get past January and the Chibi Comics release. The problem with this is that it feels like they figured this out, but we've seen no follow-up on them figuring it out. What they did with the Katara, Toph, and Suki comic felt like, oh yeah, you can do these smaller scale stories while Avatar Studios focuses on the major things. But then they just stopped them. They almost did that way too early, and then we just have had nothing for a long time. What's going on here? And it makes it feel like, how well organized is the sort of publishing side of things? Whereas it actually feels like they're getting up and going with the publishing side of things, because, they've just released or will release a Yangchen book. They're confirming a second Yangchen book, and then it has now a title, Chronicles of the Avatar, and will likely go on into who knows how many books. But the comics are just in a weird spot, and we know why. That they're not doing more ATLA comics after Imbalance, because clearly, to some extent, the second movie, if it is the Zuko movie, is going to cover material in that time period. That it would be silly of them to allow the comics to write a story that is basically right next to their story. It just runs the heavy risk of them kind of getting it wrong. So they either need to figure out a whole new era to write an Avatar story in, or do something very different. If they're doing Korra next, the Korra comic has to be some sort of a continuation from the end of those comics as well. Now, there likely will be time skips for all of these to some extent, which leaves a little bit of leeway for the comics, but I think what they're maybe going to lean towards here is that they will use Dark Horse to have tie-in comics to these movies as they release. So that way they can sort of publish it, they can use it as part of marketing materials and stuff like that. Go to the cinema, watch the new Avatar movie, and you get this tie-in comic that will explain a few things to you. I think they will maybe do stuff like that. and that's a way to use Dark Horse as the comic publisher. We'll see exactly what they do, because they definitely, I think Dark Horse need to figure something out. They need their own story they can tell. And I've always suggested the idea of, I'd love it if they just sort of set aside, like, okay, Dark Horse, here is a new avatar. This is your avatar. This is the comic avatar. This is one where, like, you're sort of out on your own. You've got a little bit more freedom. You're maybe working with this writer, this part of Avatar Studios. Mike and Brian have like slight assistance on it, just to, make it super official and stuff like that. But fundamentally, here is the Dark Horse Comics avatar. That is something unique that the comics can have, that is separate from other things. It's not going to get in the way of all these other projects that they want to do, but it allows new Avatar comics to come out and fulfills any sort of like licensing agreements and stuff like that. I feels like we need to get to that eventually. The problem, of course, is that Dark Horse have been very much, popular in a way on the backs of the fact that they got to be the continuation of both shows. They've got to do, the stuff involving the known characters. Might it be a risk to do something very different and unique with Avatar? That's the challenge in a way for them. So, delay, but the one thing I'd say about this is that it's not a month delay. Every time that this book has gotten delayed before, I think most of the time it's been a full month. This only being half a month maybe means they're finally getting ready to settle on a date. But, this is one where it's going to be a disaster if this book does not come out this year. So I think they need to do everything they can to make sure this book hits this year. Final piece of news here is this. Random House have a new book, The Power of Toph, Avatar The Last Airbender, but it's a screen comic, so who cares? January 3rd, 2023, $7.99. For anyone who is unaware, screen comics are basically these style of books. You should not really be treating this as anything particularly important. It is literally just screenshots from the show with comic speech bubbles. That's why it's called that way. This is not new content in any way, as evidenced by the fact that they basically just switched up the format slightly. They did the first like one or two of these as like Book 1 Water Volume 1, doing the episodes in order. They then switched to, I think, the book that came out like a month or two ago, Zuko Finds His Way, which is just, I think, a few Zuko-related episodes put into the comic. And this one, from the description, looks like it's just going to be basically the Blind Bandit, bit of work and stuff like that. It's just going to be a couple of Toph-focused episodes covered in the screen comic style. So unless you're just a super hardcore collector who buys everything Avatar, you do not need to care about this book in my mind. So that's that. So, in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on all of this news. But that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.